Panoptica, Cisco's cloud application security solution, provides end-to-end lifecycle protection for cloud-native application environments. It empowers organizations to safeguard their APIs, serverless functions, containers, and Kubernetes environments. Panoptica ensures comprehensive cloud security, compliance, and monitoring at scale, offering deep visibility, contextual risk assessments, and actionable remediation insights for all your cloud assets. Powered by graph-based technology, Panoptica's attack path engine prioritizes and offers dynamic remediation for vulnerable attack vectors, helping security teams quickly identify and remediate potential risks across cloud infrastructures. Panoptica utilizes advanced attack path analysis, root cause analysis, and dynamic remediation techniques to reveal potential risks from an attacker's point of view. Visit panoptica.app to learn more today. That's panoptica.app.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Another weekend perspective, and we are into June of 2024. We are into sort of what's considered the summer months, I guess here in the Northern Hemisphere, maybe the Southern Hemisphere, you're into the winter months, but summer is sort of officially here, up here in the United States, up here in the Northern Hemisphere, and hope everybody's doing well. You know, I want to do a series of shows here. I'm going to do these probably over the next couple of weeks for a couple of reasons. One, as most of you know, if you listen to the show for a little while, if you're new to the show, my name is Brian Gracely. I'm co-hosting today. But you know, for those of you that listen for a while, you know that I'm a little bit of a historian. I try and put some things in historical perspective. It helps, especially anytime we have change, to try and have a sense of, you know, is this change, is it real? Is it surface level? Is it sustainable? You know, are the building blocks in place to make these changes something that can last for a long time? So is there financial validity? Is there competitiveness in the market? All those types of things. And what I want to try and do over the next couple of weeks is look at this new sort of AI era, new AI generation, the trend around these technologies, and kind of put them into context with the last gigantic trend we've had that, you know, are like the last couple of trends that we've had. So I'm going to do a series of shows here. This will be the first one where we really kind of look at AI, at least today's AI, kind of the snapshot of where we are right now, in the context of a couple of different eras. And we're going to look at it this week in terms of what like the early 2000s look like, when the internet was really just sort of taking off, sort of even pre-cloud computing. But there was this, you know, just fascination with the idea of the internet is this technology that connects us all. It's going to allow us to, you know, create new types of businesses. It's going to create new types of business models. It's going to impact the way that we live, work, and play, all those types of things. So it was going to be this massively transformative technology that was going to not just, you know, impact some small niche of the world, but really kind of impact everything. And today I want to kind of dive into the early 2000s. Next week I'm going to dive into the 2010s, when we were looking at the beginning of cloud computing and you know, again, that sort of transition, that revolution. And then as we get towards the middle of June, we're going to dive into kind of what it looks like in comparison to even just the 2020s, the beginning of the 2020s, when we were dealing with kind of all sorts of unicorns and, you know, yes, the pandemic, but even before that, some of the sort of lead up to the 2020s. So today's show, we're going to dive into, you know, kind of making some comparisons, looking at some historical context of the early 2000s, sort of the boom of the internet, and what it looks like sort of in comparison to where we are right now with this latest sort of stage or era of AI. We'll get to that right after the break. And we're back, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And in today's show, in today's weekend perspective, we're going to dive into really looking at how today's AI is like the early 2000s. And that may seem like sort of a weird thing to do, you know, to compare today's modern technology with something 20 years ago. And you know, in to a certain extent, that is a fair comparison, right? Like, how can you compare, you know, things from 20 years, especially from a technology perspective, AI being able to do all these kind of incredible things at very, very large scale, types of scale that we never really dealt with back in the early 2000s. But I think every time there is a big transition, it's useful to take a look at not just the technology. You know, is the technology newer and better than it was in the past? And the answer to that is almost always Yes, although better is a qualitative thing. But is it faster? Are you able to do more than you were in the past? Does it unlock new opportunities that we couldn't do in the past? Yeah, I think the answer to all those things is pretty resounding yes. But I think you also have to look at it in the context of, what do the financials of this current sort of model look like? What are, which markets does these new technologies tend to sort of be targeted at? While they might feel like they're targeted at everything, are they better suited to certain markets than others? Are there viable companies or organizations or communities building technologies? And by viable, what I mean is not just could the technology be built, but is there robust competition in the market in order to create, new innovation, in order to, keep pricing at a level, sort of competitive pricing that allows more and more end users to be able to take advantage of the technology? Or is it, sort of geared towards, small niches? Looking at all those things, as well as, what does the competitive landscape look like? What does, the investment community look at these things and so forth? So I thought it would be sort of interesting to kind of dig into that. And, just for reference, for those of you that might be new to the show or may not listen all the time, if you go back to episode 772, which I put a link to in the show note, I did do a very long sort of historical review of a couple of different eras, the dot-com bubble of 2001. So there's a link in the show note for that. That's going to give you, for those of you that weren't around at that time or, weren't in technology at that time, kind of a sense of what was going on in the marketplace when the internet era sort of took off and subsequently, had its first stumble. What were the, sort of secondary effects, first order effects, second order effects of that first sort of boom and bust that happened within the industry? Who were the companies that sort of emerged out of that? What were some of the ideas that emerged out of that? What were some of the ideas that failed? So, if you're listening to this, that might be a good companion show to go take a listen to if you haven't listened to it before, or maybe use it as a companion show to listen to once again as we're kind of making this comparison where we are with AI. So I think the thing that first jumped out at me as I was starting to look at this was, back in that early 1998, 1999, 2000 era, going all the way back to like 1995 and so forth, the 2000, pre-2000s era internet or early 2000s era internet, the internet was going to change everything, right? We saw people talking about, how it was going to, unlock the ability for people around the world to communicate. New ideas were going to be, were going to happen. It was going to drive down the cost of all sorts of day-to-day activities. It was going to change business. It was going to change how we shopped, how we communicated, how we were entertained, how we were educated, all sorts of things. And I think you see a lot of that same rhetoric happening today in terms of, this new generation of AI, with it being easier to interact with, easier to use, more people have access to it. That, the conversation oftentimes is, how will this change everything we do? Everything from, how we do our day-to-day jobs. If you're a white-collar worker, how it will help everyday jobs. If you're a blue-collar worker, maybe it's going to, use computer vision to be able to help you do construction more efficiently. It's going to help manufacturing more efficiently. It's going to be able to, do things at higher velocity and better accuracy and all these sorts of things, right? We're seeing it talk about how it's going to help, doctors find cures for diseases faster, and researchers and all those sorts of things. So we're in that stage of the conversation where the canvas is basically blank. What's possible? Well, it's only restricted by your imagination to think, what if I have access to this powerful technology? What if this powerful technology is, priced at a level where, everybody has access to it, and, you don't have to necessarily be, a trained professional to be able to harness the power of this technology. So we're definitely in that same sort of era, right? We're beginning to see some interesting new technologies emerge, right? Back in the internet days, it was not only the spread of internet technology, so all of the networks that were building out and some of the speeds that were starting to evolve in terms of how fast you could download something. But we began to see, some of the early technologies like browser technology. So you didn't have to know about all the ins and outs of computers. You just sort of used this browser technology. And so we started to see some things happen with that. We began to see things happen like search and the kind of archiving of all information, into places like Yahoo and and Google and other places and all the other search things. So we were starting to see some rudimentary types of technology happen. We were starting to see it become easier to leverage the technology, and we were starting to see people talk about it in gigantic possibilities. Right now, the difference, not the difference, but the other parallel was, so from a technology perspective, we were fascinated by this, but we didn't necessarily know how to do this at scale. And I think the parallels, that we look at from a technology perspective are, we don't necessarily, know how to do all of these things. If somebody said like, hey, use a GenAI model, use ChatGPT to help you solve cancer or, solve, whatever disease you're trying to figure out. People don't necessarily know how to do that, right? They can talk about like, oh, well, I can imagine in the future this is how it was going to happen, but they don't really necessarily know how to do that. And the technology that would be needed to do that doesn't necessarily exist today, right? So we're still at a stage where there's a lot of, big ideas, but not necessarily all of the building blocks are in place. Now, the next thing that sort of happened with the internet was there was a belief that in order for this to work out, we needed to have, the biggest, fastest internet everywhere. And so, companies started to invest in that sort of space. So we saw this enormous build out of internet capabilities, of network capabilities. So people, everything from telecom companies to large banks to railroads and utilities who had right-of-ways around countries and so forth. We saw mining companies and logging companies and, like I said, utilities like train companies and energy companies who were like, we're going to invest in fiber. We're going to put this technology out in the ground. Essentially, massive build-outs of the technology way ahead of profitability, with the belief that if we are the ones that build out this capacity, that build out this capability, we will be the ones that everybody sort of has to come to in order to, in order to be able to build the next business, to build the next interesting application, to build the thing that changes the world. And I think, there's some parallels today to what we're seeing in terms of, if you just use NVIDIA as a proxy, for example, they are, their customers are, I think 40 or 50%, maybe it's more than that. I have to go back and look at the latest numbers from there, are, concentrated into 5 or 6 companies, right? The largest sort of hyperscalers. So they are building these huge farms of GPU capacity to do this. But they're still, not necessarily, haven't built necessarily business models that work on top of this, right? So we're seeing the build out of infrastructure, which is great. We're seeing sort of the hoarding of capacity in certain places, with the idea that if you are first to market in terms of having the capacity of this, gigantic idea factory, if you will, everybody will sort of come to you. And so we're starting to see a little bit of parallels there, right? We're starting to see that we haven't necessarily built a viable business model yet. And that's sort of a crazy thing to say, right? We have this thing in which we believe that, like, when technology comes along, that the people who built the technology were, intrinsically thinking about the business opportunities and the possibilities throughout the thing. And that's oftentimes not the case, right? If you go back to, looking at Google, for example, right? The technology was built to go and search the web, or, kind of crawl the web and find all the information. But the time it took them to get from kind of the original building of Google to figuring out the business model of serving ads and how to monetize it took them a number of years, right? We're still in that sort of early stage for GenAI and for building these AI models, in which we're still very much in the building out stage. The, kind of crystallizing of the business model still really isn't necessarily there yet. And we've seen a number of companies who have way overspent their capability in order, way ahead of them ability to monetize things. So, we've seen the classic early examples of, the businesses that took money, built something out, couldn't monetize it in time, couldn't figure out a way to, they figured out the technology, but they couldn't figure out. So we're seeing that, right? The other piece is, a lot of times we talk, and I talked about this, even in the early days, we built out technology, but we didn't quite know exactly how to make it work perfectly, right? It wasn't perfect in how a web browser worked. It wasn't sort of a perfect experience. You didn't necessarily have everything built in that you need. TCP/IP stacks weren't built into systems. Media stacks weren't built into systems. Security wasn't built into systems. There's a lot that was sort of, I don't want to say fundamentally left out, but just wasn't capable of being done, right? We never figured out identity on the internet, those types of things. And the parallel right now for GenAI is, to a certain extent, you still can't validate information from a GenAI model, right? They still hallucinate, and it's very possible that they will forever hallucinate. And so we're still at that stage where our perspective on the technology is such that we have certain expectations of it, but the technological capabilities of that aren't there yet. And this is where you really start to get into the velocity of the technology taking hold, finding some very early use cases that sort of everybody can adopt to, sort of lowest common denominator that everybody can adopt to. And then you figure out, are those good enough to overcome some previous limitation, right? So, on the internet, things like email and being able to get instantaneous communication between people, or, instant messaging and those types of things. Were they perfect? Were they great? No, they were, kind of clunky and so forth. But they were, vastly better than the previous thing of paying, $11 per minute to make a phone call, or, sending off a mail letter, a stamped letter to somebody, and not knowing exactly when it was going to get there. And even when it did get there, how are they going to communicate to you that it was there? So, there were some early capabilities that happened on the internet that sustained it, even though as we look back on that technology, it was kind of clunky. And right now, the thing that the internet's sort of working through with this Gen AI stuff is, can we survive with hallucinations, right? Are we seeing enough value out of it early in order to be able to sort of get people to go, okay, I'm going to find a way to overcome that. And what overcome is going to mean is going to mean different things to different people. But we're still in that stage. Now, the third thing about this is you start to look at, well, okay, which markets does it apply to? And if we go back to the early 2000s, one of the things that, right now we think of the internet and internet technologies as being pervasive everywhere in our day-to-day lives, in our business lives, in our recreations and our hobbies and all sorts of things like that. But in reality, the internet took quite a while to go from being a technology or a nice to have from a consumer perspective into something that became kind of pervasive in the same way in enterprises and, in your day-to-day work for your job. And I think we're starting to see similar types of things in the early days of Gen AI, in which, consumer end users sort of look at it as being, hey, if I am capable of spending $10 a month or $20 a month or whatever, whatever the fee is for the tools that you might be using, you look at it as like, oh, it's kind of like a very helpful assistant to me. And I'm willing to put up with whatever the limitations are. And, quite honestly, most people aren't that particular about their data, at least in terms of, things that aren't super, super personal to them. Their birth date, their social security number, maybe pictures of their kids and so forth. But taking some document that they use for work, which they don't necessarily think of as being, super critical, they're more than willing to dump it into a ChatGPT and say, hey, help me rewrite this as better copy, or, whatever it might be. And we saw that with the commercial internet, or sort of the consumer internet, right? The first applications were all consumer. It took probably 5 or 6 years before the enterprises, the businesses really started adopting it. And even then, we had these phenomenons like shadow IT, where organizations were conservative in their thinking because they were worried about, hey, how are people going to get access to things? Are firewalls in place? Do we have the right security in place? How do we encrypt things? All the things that, proper forward-thinking CIOs and IT organizations think of. Whereas end users don't necessarily think of those because they don't think of them as their responsibility. They just say, look, I have a bunch of work I want to get done. I'd like to be done 5 hours earlier so I can, cut out of work on Friday or go to the beach or, go to my hobby for the evening or something. And I think we're seeing that today. So I think what we're going to see is consumer AI, GenAI, take off in a much broader way than we will for the enterprise for at least a few years, at least in mass. And again, this is because we haven't quite figured out a business model. We're still doing these things at scale where things like security are sort of a secondary consideration. Standards haven't necessarily in place for, which Gen AI model do I use? How do I evaluate those things? And so, we will see sort of shadow Gen AI groups emerge in the enterprise or in your business. A group that has a few people that understand the technology, are smart enough to figure that out. Now that might accelerate faster because, unlike the 2000s where that generation of folks hadn't grown up, sort of living, breathing, being around technology all the time. Unlike, sort of the newer generation of workers who probably can figure this stuff out faster than we necessarily did in the 2000s. So, but I think we will see, much faster adoption on the consumer side. We'll see the companies that are driving this stuff start to focus on more consumer types of end user types of things, and this is where we'll see Apple and we'll see Google with the phone. We'll see consumer types of applications around this stuff. I'm sure there will be some sort of teenage fad that will take off that has Gen AI to do with it, just like we saw with Snapchat or other things like that. But yeah, I think that's the case. And, we're building towards some things that do have some parallels, right? We've got this sort of glut of the technology being built. We haven't necessarily figured out a use case that's pervasive across everywhere. We haven't quite figured out a business model for some of these things yet. So, I think I'm not by any means predicting that in a few years, we're going to have a massive crash like we did the .com bubble. But, there are some parallels that I think as you're looking at the market, are worth kind of looking at in terms of, are these exactly parallel? No, not perfect parallels, but they are parallel in terms of we have a very new technology. There are huge sort of halo types of perspectives on what the technology can do. We haven't quite figured out viable business models that work across a lot of different companies or a lot of different industries. We found a few, and some of those will sustain us. We're yet to see how human beings will adapt to the limitations of the technology versus the expansions of the technology, right? That sort of, hey, it can do a lot of things for me, but sometimes it gets things wrong through hallucinations or whatever. How does the human brain process having to navigate those two things, sort of absolute truth and absolute uncertainty, somewhere in between. And then I think that the third piece is when we first started looking at the internet, it was sort of very much, I don't know, kind of a toy. Kind of, we looked at it as like, an interesting thing to do would be to put up a static web page or to, just be able to do basic communications over it. And so they were, kind of basic skills and so forth. And we're still sort of doing that with Gen AI, right? We haven't quite moved into the stage. People are still sort of looking at Gen AI as a way to offload stuff they don't want to do. Whereas we really haven't quite reached the stage where we're looking at Gen AI as something that kind of augments our expertise in whatever skill set you have. And so I think we're, kind of evolving from, or we're going to have to evolve from it just doing the lowest level work that we don't want to do, the busy work, the low value things, to going, how does it add net new value to what we're doing? And that was sort of similar to what we saw in the early, I guess, sort of 2000, late 1990, 99 days. Anyways, I kind of throwing these things out there just as you're looking at the market, when there's a lot going on, when there's a lot of change, sometimes it's good to look at something that has happened before and say, okay, are there parallels to this? Because it can help you mentally sort of map out a roadmap and go, okay, what worked well during those times in early eras? What didn't work well? And then where are there no parallels whatsoever? And those might be the areas that are kind of what they call white space in terms of opportunities to go start something new, to go create something new. And those are areas that, I think as people analyze kind of where we are today versus where we've been in the past, I guess, again, at least in terms of transitions, we will start to see the startups and the companies and the technologies that nobody was thinking about, nobody was talking about, but become the things that really sort of push this to the next level, to the next kind of frontier of what we're doing. So with that, I'll wrap up. Again, I'm going to try and do this as a series over the next couple of weeks. Just gives us a sense of, where have we been? How have we overcome similar hurdles? How have we looked at, technology? Where has things been successful? Where have they struggled? And we'll kind of go from there. So hopefully you enjoyed this first episode, kind of weekend perspective on looking at where we are today with AI versus, say, the last 10 years and the last couple of transitions. And we will follow up on the 2010s next week, the 2020s the week after that. And so thank you for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the community. Thanks for recommending the show to your friends and so forth. And again, any feedback you've got or questions you've got that we can help, show@thecloudcast.net. Happy to try and help you out with some of those things. With that, we'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.